This Sunday's Gospel reading presents Jesus before starting his 3 years of public ministry, spending 40 days in the desert. In that desert, Jesus faces down 3 temptations that the devil sets before him. Consider how the first 2 readings set the stage for the temptations of Jesus. The first reading is 2 passages from the book of Genesis. The former is from Genesis chapter 2, verses 7 to 9, describing God creating Adam and placing him in the Garden of Eden. That sets the stage for the latter passage, which is from Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 to 7. It describes the original sin of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were tempted in the midst of an earthly paradise, with all their needs already met. Yet the devil is successful in tempting them. This temptation in Eden stands in contrast with the temptation of Jesus Christ in the desert. The second reading is from the 5th chapter of St. Paul's letter to the Romans. This reading has a longer version and a shorter one. In the longer version, St. Paul describes Adam using a very important word. St. Paul describes Adam as the type of the one to come. St. Paul, writing in Greek, uses the word tupos, which is clearly related to our English word type. In other versions of the Bible, this word is translated instead as figure or foreshadowing. In the Latin Vulgate, this word is rendered figura. However, the word type is especially helpful in unpacking St. Paul's doctrine. If you've ever seen a typewriter, you might have noticed that the letters and symbols on the type bars are backwards. Of course, they have to be backwards in order to leave an image in the correct way. So the shape of each letter on a type bar is exactly like the letter it leaves on the page, with the exception of being reversed. It's in this sense that St. Paul preaches about the relationship between Adam and Jesus Christ. In the beginning, everything that God created was good. Eden bore every good thing that Adam needed. Adam and Eve themselves were created good. They took good things and through their sin turned them inside out by using them to glorify themselves instead of God. Given this inversion that Adam introduced into the world, God designed to redeem man by a similar means, but in reverse. St. Paul, both in the 5th chapter of Romans and in the 15th chapter of his first letter to the Corinthians, develops his typology of Adam and Jesus. As Adam had turned inside out the goodness of creation by an evil use of the will, so Jesus turns inside out the evil of Adam. Jesus concludes this work of redemption on Calvary at the end of Lent. Here, at the start of Lent, that work involves 3 temptations from the devil. So keep in mind the connection between the event in this Sunday's Gospel reading and the event of the crucifixion on Good Friday. In a sense, we're on a 40-day pilgrimage to the top of Calvary. If we cannot share with Jesus in rejecting temptations, we won't be able to stand fast with Christ as he offers his whole self, body and blood, soul and divinity for sinful man on the cross. How can we profitably meditate upon this Sunday's Gospel reading, which comes from the 4th chapter of Matthew, verses 1 through 11? The saints of the Church are always ready to help us, and one of the best saints to turn to in this regard is St. Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century Dominican friar and priest. In his masterful work, The Summary of Theology, St. Thomas discusses the temptations of Jesus in the desert. He makes 3 points that we might take up for our own meditation. His first point is that Jesus wished to be tempted in the desert. St. Thomas offers 4 reasons why Jesus wanted to do so. The first reason is so that Jesus might strengthen us against temptations. The second is that we might be warned, that is, so that no one might think himself exempt from the risk of temptation to evil. The third is that we might have Jesus' example of how to overcome temptation. The fourth is that we might have good reason to have confidence in his divine mercy, since, and here St. Thomas quotes from Hebrews chapter 4, we have not a high priest who cannot have compassion on our infirmities, but one tempted in all things like as we are, without sin. St. Thomas Aquinas' second point about Jesus' temptations concerns the manner in which he overcomes them. St. Thomas paraphrases St. Augustine of Hippo in explaining that Christ came to destroy the works of the devil not by powerful deeds, but rather by the suffering of him and his body, so as to conquer the devil by righteousness, not by power. We might say, in other words, that Christ conquers the devil on Calvary and here in the desert, not by snapping his divine fingers, but through human virtue, human suffering, and human death. Along the same line, St. Thomas, later in the same question, notes that Christ resisted these temptations by quoting the authority of the law, not by enforcing his power. St. Thomas then quotes Pope Leo the Great in noting that Christ did this, quote, so as to give more honor to his human nature and a greater punishment to his adversary, since the foe of the human race was vanquished, not as by God, but as by man, end quote. The third point that St. Thomas Aquinas makes about Jesus' temptations is how they relate to the temptation of Adam. Here again, this Sunday's first reading sets the stage for the Gospel reading. St. Thomas begins by making a general point, which applies not only to Adam and Jesus, but also to Christians in our own day. St. Thomas notes that, quote, the devil does not straightaway tempt the spiritual man to grave sins, but he begins with lighter sins, so as gradually to lead him to those of greater magnitude, end quote. Then St. Thomas demonstrates how this principle is operative in the cases both of Adam and Jesus Christ. At first, St. Thomas notes, the devil enticed Adam to consent to eating forbidden fruit. Second, he tempted Adam to vainglory by saying that his eyes would be opened. Third, he tempted Adam to what Thomas calls the extreme height of pride by saying that Adam and Eve should be as gods. The devil observed this same order in tempting Christ, St. Thomas explains. For at first he tempted him to that which men desire, however spiritual they may be, namely, the support of the corporeal nature by food. Secondly, he advanced to that matter in which spiritual men are sometimes found wanting, inasmuch as they do certain things for show, which pertains to vainglory. Thirdly, he led the temptation on to that in which no spiritual men, but only carnal men have a part, namely, to desire worldly riches and fame, to the extent of holding God in contempt. Give thanks, then, on the first Sunday of Lent, that we have such a Savior as Jesus Christ. He turns inside out the original sin of Adam by facing temptation and death through the humility of his human nature. In this, we have such a great high priest whom we can approach with confidence and understanding.